Reese Calder walked into the precinct with a sealed order and no escort, and Officer Mira Drayton laughed in his face. She blocked the hallway, looked at his plain gray suit, and said the words that would follow her for the rest of her career. Captain Harlan Quill strolled out moments later, refusing to check a single piece of identification, and ordered his officers to confiscate the stranger's phone instead. Nobody in that building knew who Reese really was, or why a locksmith named Elias Thorne had been sitting handcuffed to a bench for hours with no charges filed against him. Then a phone rang at the front desk, and every officer in the room went quiet at once. Reese had not come to file a complaint. He had come to end a captain's career before the day was done. If you want to watch arrogance collapse in real time, stay until the end, because this story earns every second of it. The message arrived in the early hours. 3 words stitched together in a language only 2 people in the city would recognize as a warning rather than a routine memo. And Reese Calder read it twice before he swung his legs out of bed. The sender worked inside the 12th precinct and had agreed, months earlier, to flag anything that smelled like evidence being reorganized before anyone official arrived to look at it. Reorganized was the word the department liked to use. What it usually meant was that something inconvenient was about to disappear. Reese had spent years as a federal prosecutor chasing exactly that kind of disappearance, and he had learned that the difference between corruption and an honest mistake was almost always a matter of timing. He showered quickly, dressed in the same unremarkable suit he wore to every meeting that mattered, and checked the leather folder on his dresser one more time before he left the house. Inside that folder sat 4 things that would matter more than any badge pinned to his chest. There was his digital credential, a small card that linked to a citywide verification system the department could check in under a minute if anyone bothered to try. There was the preservation order freshly signed by the Public Safety Commission, instructing every precinct in the city to halt any transfer or destruction of evidence until further notice. There was his appointment letter naming him Acting Deputy Commissioner for Professional Standards and Police Accountability, a title that had been approved earlier that morning and transmitted electronically to every precinct captain in the city. And there was an emergency authorization code, one that could summon the entire Inspector General's office to a single address within the hour if things went wrong. Reese had barely spoken a word during breakfast that morning, turning the plan over in his mind while his coffee went cold on the counter beside him. He had built his career on the belief that institutions revealed their true character not in press conferences or polished reports, but in the small, unwitnessed moments when nobody thought their conduct would ever be scrutinized. His assistant, Tessa Lang, had offered to send a city vehicle with 2 uniformed officers to accompany him, and Reese had declined without hesitation. An escort would announce him before he ever stepped through the door, and a captain given advance warning was a captain who had time to prepare an explanation. Reese did not want an explanation. He wanted to see how a precinct behaved when it believed no one of consequence was watching. That was the only way to learn the truth about a place like the 12th, where community complaints about missing property had piled up for years without a single formal investigation. He drove himself, parked 2 blocks away out of habit, and walked the rest of the way in the gray light of early morning. The morning air outside carried the damp chill of a city not yet fully awake, and Reese walked the 2 blocks with his collar turned up, going over the sequence of the morning in his mind, the way he once rehearsed opening statements before a jury. He had learned early in his career that the first moments inside any building told him more than an hour of testimony ever could, because people revealed themselves honestly only in the moments before they realized someone was paying attention. The precinct lobby smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead, and the linoleum floor still bore the scuff marks of a long overnight shift that nobody had bothered to clean. The first thing Reese noticed was a heavy-set man in his late 50s sitting on a metal bench near the intake counter, one wrist cuffed to a bar bolted into the wall. The man's name, Reese would later learn, was Elias Thorne, and he had owned a locksmith shop 3 blocks from that precinct for over 20 years. There was no paperwork clipped to the bench beside him, no visible booking number, nothing that explained why a business owner with no criminal history was restrained like a flight risk. Elias lifted his head and looked at Reese with something between hope and exhaustion, the look of a man wondering if a stranger in a suit might finally be someone who could help him. A young officer nearby snapped at him to keep his head down. Reese filed that image away without reacting to it, because reacting was exactly what would make a precinct dig in its heels. He approached the intake counter instead, set his folder down without opening it yet, and asked in a calm, level voice to speak with whoever was supervising the current shift. He had not raised his voice, had not mentioned his title, had not done anything that should have triggered suspicion in a functioning department. But Officer Mira Drayton looked him over, the way a bouncer sizes up someone who does not belong on the guest list, and her mouth curled into something just short of a smirk before she answered him at all. Mira Drayton had been on the force for years, most of them spent comfortably under the protection of Captain Harlan Quill, who treated her less like a subordinate and more like a favorite. She had learned in that time that confidence read as authority to almost everyone who walked through the precinct doors, and she wielded that confidence like a weapon whenever someone unfamiliar showed up asking questions. She did not ask for Reese's name. She looked at the folder under his arm, at his ordinary shoes, at the fact that he had walked in alone, and decided in an instant that he was either a lawyer chasing a payout or a relative of someone already in custody come to make noise on their behalf. Neither category, in her mind, deserved patience. "You here to file a complaint, or are you looking for somebody we already picked up?" she asked, letting the question land somewhere between bored and contemptuous, loud enough that 2 officers near the coffee station turned to watch. Reese answered evenly that his name was Reese Calder, that he needed to speak with whoever was managing the evidence room, and that all activity related to the man handcuffed to the bench needed to stop immediately. He reached toward his folder to retrieve his credential, but Mira cut him off before his fingers touched the clasp, telling him this was not a television courtroom and that he could sit down and wait his turn like everyone else. She raised her voice again, apparently for the benefit of her colleagues, mocking the formal cadence of his sentences, as though a calm request for accountability were itself an act of aggression. Reese repeated himself once more, breaking his request into 3 simple parts so there could be no confusion about what he was asking. Nobody was to enter the evidence room. The interview involving Elias Thorne needed to stop immediately. Whoever was supervising the shift needed to come to the front desk in person. Mira stepped out from behind the counter and planted herself directly in his path, close enough that he could smell her coffee, and told him the line that would echo through the department for weeks afterward, the 4 words that summed up everything wrong with how her precinct treated people it did not respect. "You don't give orders here," she said, putting particular weight on the last word as if the building itself belonged to her, and people like Reese existed only at its edges. 2 younger officers nearby laughed under their breath, neither of them bothering to check who this man actually was, both content to let Mira handle a stranger the way she always handled strangers who annoyed her. Reese asked, without a trace of anger in his voice, whether she would like to verify his identification before continuing. She told him that men who caused trouble in her precinct usually carried fake credentials and inflated titles, and that she had heard every version of that trick before. When Reese reached for his phone to pull up his digital city clearance, Mira snatched it out of his hand under the pretense of officer safety and dropped it into a drawer behind the counter, informing him he would get it back once he decided to cooperate. Sergeant Sienna Hale watched the entire exchange from a few feet away, close enough to intervene but hesitant to insert herself into a confrontation that seemed on its surface like a routine dispute with an irritated visitor. Sienna had spent years at the 12th Precinct, without ever fully joining the tight circle that orbited Captain Quill, and she had learned to pick her battles carefully in a building where loyalty mattered more than procedure. She noticed Mira glance toward the ceiling camera with something close to confidence, the look of someone who believed she was protected no matter what she did, and that glance unsettled Sienna more than the confrontation itself. Reese checked his watch without drawing attention to the motion, aware that the message he had received that morning gave him limited time before whatever was happening in the evidence room reached a point of no return. The hallway had gone quiet in the way hallways do when everyone senses a shift in the air before anything visible has actually happened. Officers pausing mid-motion near the coffee station, phones lowered halfway, eyes drifting toward the corridor at the far end of the room. A door at the end of the hallway swung open, and Captain Harlan Quill emerged, adjusting his cuffs with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been questioned inside his own building. Quill was in his mid-50s, the product of a wealthy family with decades of quiet influence over the city council and the police union, and he had learned to project warmth for cameras while running his precinct like a private fiefdom behind closed doors. He looked at Mira first, then at the stranger standing near the front counter, and asked in a voice pitched for an audience who was wasting the time of one of his officers this morning. Reese introduced himself fully this time, stating his name and asking for a private conversation away from the lobby, and something flickered across Quill's face at the sound of that name, a name he recognized from a memo the city had circulated earlier. But Quill had never seen a photograph attached to that memo, and he was not about to let an unfamiliar face embarrass him in front of a room full of subordinates who expected him to control every situation without hesitation. He asked, with feigned indifference, whether the man had an appointment scheduled, and Reese suggested he simply check the credential in his folder or place a call to the deputy mayor's office to confirm everything within minutes. Quill did not look at the folder. He told Mira to keep hold of the phone and instructed Reese to step away from the working area of his precinct. Reese gestured toward Elias Thorne and asked directly what legal basis justified holding him for so many hours without documentation, and Quill answered vaguely that the man was assisting with an ongoing matter, a phrase so deliberately hollow it could have meant anything or nothing at all. Elias spoke up from the bench, his voice raw from hours of silence, explaining that he had been there since the previous evening and had been pressured to sign a statement he had never even been allowed to read in full. His hands ached from the cuff biting into his wrist, and the fluorescent light overhead had given him a headache hours earlier. But what troubled him most was the quiet certainty that no one in that building intended to let him leave until he agreed to whatever version of events they preferred. He thought of his shop, dark and locked since the previous morning, and of the customers who would find the gate down with no explanation at all. Quill snapped at him to be quiet, and Reese repeated his request that the interview stop and that any surveillance footage from that morning be preserved exactly as it existed right now. Quill let out a short, dismissive laugh and remarked that the city had recently taken to sending reformers in tailored suits to lecture working officers about how to do their jobs, and suggested that Reese return to whatever office building had sent him, where speeches might frighten people more easily than they did here. He ordered 2 officers to escort Elias into a back interview room, and Reese stepped into the narrow hallway to block the path, careful not to touch anyone, stating clearly that from this moment forward, any further contact with that witness would be treated as tampering. Mira smiled and asked how exactly he planned to document anything, given that his phone was sitting in a drawer behind her counter. Quill, growing impatient, ordered 2 officers to escort Reese into the small room reserved for civilian complainants until he calmed down, and this time nobody hesitated to obey him. Before the door closed, Reese looked directly at Quill and told him that he had just been given 3 separate opportunities to verify who he was speaking to and that he had refused all 3. Sienna Hale, watching from near the records desk, saw a precinct technician quietly carrying a small file box toward the rear exit, and something in her stomach tightened as she began to wonder whether the stranger's warning about the evidence room had been real after all. She had spent years telling herself that the small oddities she noticed around the building, a missing signature here, a resealed envelope there, added up to nothing more than the ordinary sloppiness of an overworked precinct. Watching that box move toward the door now, she felt the weight of every one of those small dismissals pressing down on her at once, and she made a decision that morning to stop looking away. Reese did not resist when the door shut behind him, because he had already planned for exactly this outcome before he ever stepped inside the building. Tessa Lang was parked 2 blocks away with a phone in her lap, and the two of them had agreed that if Reese failed to check in within a short window, she would trigger a formal escalation with the Inspector General's office immediately. Outside the small holding room, Sienna quietly positioned herself near the rear exit and stopped the technician from carrying the file box any further, citing the department's own chain of custody rules about unlogged evidence transfers. Quill told her to step aside, but Sienna, calm and unwavering, reminded him that any transfer without a logged authorization would violate procedures he himself had signed off on years earlier. Somewhere behind the reinforced door, Reese sat listening to muffled voices in the hallway, counting the seconds against the window Tessa had promised to honor. The desk phone rang at the front counter, sharp and insistent against the low murmur of the precinct, and Mira answered it with the same bored tone she used for every call that morning, until the voice on the other end identified itself as the Chief of Staff for the Public Safety Commission. The caller asked, without preamble, to be connected immediately to Acting Deputy Commissioner Reese Calder, and Mira's expression shifted from irritation to something closer to alarm as she glanced toward the small room where they had just locked him inside. Quill grabbed the receiver from her hand, attempting to explain that there had been some confusion regarding an unannounced visitor's identity, but the voice on the line was not interested in explanations. The caller informed Quill that Reese Calder had been lawfully appointed earlier that morning, that the 12th Precinct had received official electronic notice of the appointment hours earlier, and that a preservation order covering all evidence in the building had taken effect the moment Reese walked through the front door. Sienna, standing nearby, pulled up the precinct's internal messaging system on a nearby terminal and discovered that Quill had opened that very notice well before Reese ever arrived. Reese was released from the small room and walked back into the hallway where Mira silently handed over his phone, all traces of her earlier smugness gone from her face. He opened the folder calmly, set the signed order bearing the city seal on the front counter, and pulled up his digital credential for anyone who still wished to check it. He did not raise his voice or reach for insults, choosing instead to read aloud, one by one, the specific actions that had taken place that morning inside a supposedly professional building. He named the refusal to verify a duly authorized official. He named the confiscation of a city employee's communication device. He named the continued pressure applied to a witness after a preservation order had already taken effect. He named the attempted removal of evidence after formal notice had already been received. He named the deliberate concealment of that notice from officers working the floor. Quill tried to order Mira to escort Reese out of the building, but not a single officer in the hallway moved to obey him this time. Reese turned to face the captain directly and delivered the sentence that would end Harlan Quill's command of that precinct before the day was fully underway. "Captain Harlan Quill," he said, "you are suspended from duty, effective immediately, pending a full administrative investigation." He instructed Quill to surrender his service weapon, his command credential, and the keys to the evidence room, all to be handed directly to Sergeant Sienna Hale. It was Mira herself who was forced by procedure to physically take the weapon from the man she had spent years protecting, her hands trembling slightly as she did it. The room had gone utterly silent by then. Every officer within earshot watched a man who had never once been challenged inside his own precinct suddenly discover that his authority had limits after all. Quill's face had drained of its earlier color, replaced by something tighter and more calculating, and he glanced briefly toward Winthrop's name, saved in his phone, before he spoke again. Quill warned Reese in a low and furious voice that people with far more influence than a City Hall appointee would make this decision disappear before the end of the day. Reese answered simply that the suspension was only the beginning of what needed to happen inside that building, and that nothing about his position depended on Quill's approval or his threats. As the evidence room keys passed into Sienna's hand, she leaned close to Reese and whispered that an entire file box had gone missing from that room sometime the previous night, information she had been too afraid to raise until this exact moment. Word traveled fast once Quill made his calls from the parking lot, and by the time the sun had fully cleared the rooftops across the street, a different kind of pressure had already begun assembling itself outside the precinct doors. Vincent Crowe arrived at the precinct less than an hour later, dressed in the kind of tailored suit that announced money before he ever opened his mouth. Representing the police union, and, more quietly, the Quill family itself, whose friendship with Crowe stretched back decades, his voice carried the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to winning arguments simply by outlasting everyone else in the room. He accused Reese of abusing his newly granted authority, of deliberately arriving without a uniform or an escort in order to entrap hard-working officers, and demanded the immediate reinstatement of Captain Quill while threatening a lawsuit against the city on his client's behalf. A short clip of the morning's confrontation had already surfaced online, conveniently edited to show only Reese standing in the hallway with no trace of Mira's earlier refusal to verify his credentials or her seizure of his phone. Public reaction split quickly along predictable lines, with some accusing Reese of manufacturing a scandal on his very first day in office to make a name for himself at Quill's expense. Reese refused to hold a press conference to answer any of it, choosing instead to spend the morning inside the evidence room with his small team of investigators, cataloging every irregularity they could find before anyone had a chance to correct it. They discovered 3 separate cash bags with no corresponding case numbers attached to them anywhere in the system. They discovered 2 hard drives from the precinct's surveillance system that had been relabeled under entirely different case numbers than the ones assigned to them originally. They discovered a torn page from the evidence log and a pattern connecting nearly every irregular case to small, independently owned businesses within a 6-block radius of the precinct. Elias Thorne's own file contained no arrest warrant, no formal detention paperwork, and no signature from any prosecutor authorizing his continued questioning. Elias eventually told Reese, in a voice still shaking from exhaustion, that he had personally witnessed Quill and Mira carrying a silver metal case from the evidence room out to the captain's private vehicle sometime in the earliest hours of that morning. Reese needed Elias's formal statement to widen the investigation beyond the walls of a single precinct. But before Elias could put his signature to paper, Crowe appeared with a document claiming that Elias himself was now under investigation for filing a false report. Frightened for the survival of the shop he had built over 2 decades, Elias withdrew his statement entirely, leaving Reese without the one witness who could tie everything together cleanly. Reese understood immediately that Quill was still steering the machinery of the department from somewhere outside the building, using influence rather than a badge to hold his position together. Reese noticed the speed of it immediately, the kind of urgency that rarely accompanied ordinary municipal business, and he understood exactly whose influence had pushed the request through so quickly. Meanwhile, the city council announced an emergency hearing to reconsider Reese's suspension order, a hearing scheduled with unusual speed for a case barely a day old. As Crowe turned to leave the precinct, he told Reese, almost cheerfully, that Quill would be back behind his desk by the next morning, and that Reese himself would go down in the city's history as the man who lasted the shortest amount of time in his position. Reese asked Sienna for complete server access logs rather than relying on the paper records kept inside the precinct itself, and Sienna admitted that she had quietly enabled an automatic backup of the evidence room's activity to an external city maintenance server years earlier, suspecting even then that something was wrong. Those backup logs showed that Mira's credentials had accessed the evidence room in the middle of the night, and that Quill's own command badge had opened the rear parking gate barely a minute later. Reese did not rush to arrest anyone or draw premature conclusions from a single timestamp, choosing instead to understand what that silver case actually contained and who was truly directing its movement. Street cameras several blocks away tracked Quill's vehicle to a storage warehouse owned by a private security company connected to relatives of Vincent Crowe himself. Financial records revealed that this same company had received repeated payments drawn from the precinct's forfeiture fund, money seized from ordinary citizens under the justification of ongoing investigations. Quill had personally approved a string of no-bid contracts labeled as emergency officer training, contracts that existed on paper but produced no actual training that anyone could verify. Money and property confiscated from small local businesses had quietly become the operating budget of a company controlled by people close to Quill's own attorney. Reading through the stack of dismissed complaints late into the evening, Reese recognized a pattern he had seen before in other cities, where the people least equipped to fight back were always the ones chosen first. Reese discovered that many of these business owners had filed complaints over the years, every single one of them stamped as unsubstantiated by Quill's own office before ever reaching an outside reviewer. The interview room where Mira waited was smaller than the one Reese had briefly been locked inside that morning, and the irony of that was not lost on either of them when he finally sat down across the table. Mira was called in separately for questioning, still convinced at first that Reese only wanted to pressure her into betraying the captain who had protected her career for nearly a decade. Reese showed her the access logs without revealing the full extent of everything his team had already uncovered, watching her carefully as she absorbed what the timestamps actually meant. Mira insisted she had merely followed orders regarding a routine evidence transfer, nothing more complicated than that. Reese asked her, gently but pointedly, why a lawful transfer would occur in the middle of the night with no signature and no witness present to confirm it. Mira said nothing, her jaw tightening as the silence stretched between them, and Reese recognized in that silence something closer to fear of Quill than any remaining loyalty to him. He told her plainly that she would eventually be held accountable for the choices she had made, but that Quill was already preparing to make her the only person who had ever touched that evidence room. He showed her a written statement Quill had already submitted to Crowe, one in which the captain claimed complete ignorance of anything Mira had done that night. Mira realized, reading her own name in that statement, that the man she had shielded for years intended to let every consequence land squarely on her shoulders alone. She did not confess anything that afternoon, but something in her eyes had visibly shifted by the time she stood up to leave the room. Before she reached the door, Mira paused and turned back toward Reese, telling him quietly that the silver case never contained any money at all. It held the original hard drives from officers' personal body cameras, recordings. Quill could never allow anyone outside his circle to see under any circumstances. Mira admitted that those drives documented what Quill privately called a neighborhood order initiative, a campaign that had nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with pressuring small business owners into surrendering cash or property without any lawful order behind it. She confessed that she had once believed this campaign served some necessary purpose, a belief that had eroded slowly as she noticed the same pattern repeating itself over years, without exception. Every business targeted, she admitted, belonged to owners unlikely to afford a lawyer or push back against an entire police precinct standing at their door. Reese did not offer Mira forgiveness for what she revealed, reminding her instead that her own arrogance in that hallway that morning had helped a corrupt system continue operating unchecked for as long as it had. Mira agreed to sign a formal statement, asking only for protection from retaliation, and Reese promised her nothing beyond a fair and lawful process, no guarantee of leniency attached to her cooperation. The warehouse itself sat behind a chain-link fence at the edge of an industrial stretch of the city, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of building nobody would look at twice while driving past it on their way somewhere else. His investigators secured a warrant for the storage warehouse identified through the surveillance footage, and inside they found the original hard drives, evidence bags stripped of their identifying labels, a list of unreported seizures stretching back years, and a recorded conversation between Quill and Crow discussing exactly how to manage Mira's exposure. In that recording, Quill described Mira as arrogant enough to do anything asked of her and foolish enough to absorb every consequence alone, a description that shattered whatever remaining loyalty Mira still carried for the man. One surviving segment of body camera footage confirmed that Elias Thorne had committed no crime whatsoever, that he had simply witnessed officers transferring property without proper documentation and had been silenced for seeing it happen. Quill had ordered Elias brought back to the precinct specifically to coerce a false statement from him, hoping to bury the one witness who could connect everything together. Reese released a formal notice confirming that Elias had been detained unlawfully and dismissed every baseless charge that had ever been filed against him, and Elias agreed with visible relief to testify at the upcoming hearing. Quill still believed even then that his political connections would prevent any of this evidence from ever reaching a formal hearing room. Crow filed a motion demanding that every document gathered after the suspension be thrown out entirely, arguing that Reese's appointment had never technically been finalized before he arrived at the precinct that morning. Reese reviewed his own appointment records and discovered that a single confirmation page had been quietly withdrawn from the city's public database only minutes before the hearing was set to begin, a discovery that told him exactly how far Quill's allies were still willing to reach. Rows of folding chairs had been set up along the back wall to accommodate the overflow crowd, and the air inside carried the particular tension of a room full of people who had already decided long before any testimony began which outcome they wanted to see. The hearing room filled quickly with reporters, off-duty officers, and city council representatives all crowded together to witness what many assumed would be Harlan Quill's swift and total vindication. Quill arrived in a freshly pressed uniform despite his ongoing suspension, projecting the same unshaken confidence he had carried into every room of his career. Crow opened by arguing that Reese lacked a fully executed signature on his appointment, insisting that every order he had issued that morning was therefore legally void from the very start. A council member, with long-standing family ties to the Quills, proposed reinstating the captain's command on the spot, framing the entire suspension as an overreach by an unproven outsider. Reese did not react when a few voices in the room mocked the fact that he had arrived at the precinct without a single escort that morning, treating it as evidence of his own arrogance rather than his commitment to seeing the truth clearly. He calmly presented the original electronic record of his appointment, explaining that the document Crow referenced was only a public-facing copy, while the legally binding version had been digitally signed and archived on a state server hours before he ever set foot inside the building. He pointed out that the deletion of the public copy only added a fresh layer of evidence to the growing case against interference in a federal and municipal investigation. One by one, Reese laid out everything his team had assembled over the preceding days without raising his voice a single time. He presented the internal notice Quill had opened before Reese ever arrived. He presented the evidence room access logs, showing an unauthorized transfer in the middle of the night. He presented footage confirming that Elias Thorne had been held without any lawful basis whatsoever. He presented the contracts linking Quill's approvals to a company quietly controlled by people close to Crow. He presented the recording in which Quill discussed how to let Mira absorb every consequence in his place. Quill attempted to dismiss Mira as a disgruntled officer, inventing lies to save herself from discipline. But Mira walked into the room at that exact moment, placed her badge and identification on the table in front of the panel, and confirmed in a steady voice that the recording was authentic, and that the voice belonged to her former captain. Sienna Hale testified that Quill had personally instructed her to disable the evidence room's automatic backup logging, an order she had quietly refused to follow. Elias described in careful detail exactly how he had been threatened with the loss of his shop unless he signed a statement containing information he knew to be false. Reese did not deliver a lengthy closing statement to the panel. Instead, he asked Quill a single direct question that the captain could not answer without incriminating himself further. "Yesterday morning," Reese said, "you told me I had no authority to give orders inside your precinct. Are you now denying that you knew exactly who I was the entire time?" Quill had no answer that would not condemn him outright, and the council voted to uphold the suspension while referring the entire matter to a special prosecutor for further review. Crow was formally removed from any further role in the proceedings due to an undeniable conflict of interest tied to his own financial relationships. Mira was placed under a separate suspension pending review of her individual conduct and responsibility in the matter. Cameras outside caught the moment clearly, the same doors he had walked through as a commanding figure for decades now serving as the exit for his disgrace. Quill was escorted out through the public entrance reserved for ordinary citizens, stripped of the badge and the entourage that had followed him for the entirety of his career. As he passed Reese near the exit, he murmured that the department would never accept a man like him. And Reese answered simply that he had not come there seeking acceptance, only to see the law properly enforced. Reporters camped outside the city building for days, and Reese answered their questions only in brief, measured statements, refusing to let the case become a spectacle built around his own name. The city moved carefully in the aftermath, aware that a case of this size would be scrutinized from every direction, and Reese insisted that each finding be independently verified before any public statement was released. In the time that followed, the expanded investigation confirmed dozens of unlawful seizures that Quill had concealed for years behind a wall of falsified paperwork and quiet intimidation. He was formally terminated, permanently stripped of any command authority, and now faces charges of obstruction, evidence tampering, and misuse of public funds entrusted to his precinct. Crow became the subject of a separate inquiry into his role in transporting evidence and concealing financial ties that should never have existed between an attorney and the department he claimed to merely represent. Mira sat through the disciplinary hearing without the confidence that had once defined her presence in that hallway, answering every question directly and without the smugness that had shaped her earliest encounter with Reese. Mira appeared before a disciplinary board where her cooperation earned her a reduced penalty, but not a full pardon, since Reese made clear that testifying honestly did not erase the way she had once treated a stranger with open contempt. Her professional certification remains under formal review, her badge indefinitely suspended pending the outcome. Elias reopened his shop within the week, the gate rolling up on a Monday morning to the quiet relief of neighbors who had wondered where he had gone. Elias Thorne received a formal public apology from the city, along with compensation for the many hours he had spent unlawfully detained inside that precinct. Every piece of property seized without proper documentation was eventually returned to its rightful owners, a slow process that nonetheless restored something more than money to people who had been dismissed for years. Sienna accepted the position with visible reluctance at first, aware of how much work remained to rebuild trust inside a building that had operated for years under quiet corruption. Sienna Hale was appointed acting captain of the 12th Precinct, though Reese insisted that every future candidate for permanent command undergo independent review rather than simple internal promotion. Reese spent considerable time drafting these reforms himself, aware that punishing a single captain meant little, if the same conditions remained in place to produce another one eventually. New procedures were introduced across every precinct in the city as a direct result of what had happened that morning. Every official credential now had to be verified before it could be dismissed. No one could be detained without a documented and reviewable basis. Evidence logs were backed up automatically outside the walls of any single precinct. Every citizen complaint received a tracking number that no commanding officer could quietly erase. The precinct looked almost the same as it had on that first morning, the same scuffed floor and buzzing fluorescent light, though something in the way people moved through it had changed in ways that were hard to name but impossible to miss. In a quiet scene later, Reese returned to the same hallway where Mira had once blocked his path and mocked his title in front of an entire room of officers. The building fell silent as he walked through it, though he asked nothing of anyone, expecting no salute and demanding no special deference from the people around him. The man at the counter looked nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the same posture Elias had carried on that first morning. He stopped near the front counter, where an ordinary man was attempting to file a complaint about a matter that had nothing to do with him personally. The officer on duty pulled out a chair, confirmed the man's name, and began recording his statement exactly the way procedure required, without hesitation and without condescension. Reese said nothing to anyone in that moment. He simply continued walking toward the evidence room, satisfied by the smallest and most ordinary sign that something in that building had finally changed for good. He thought of Elias's reopening, of Sienna stepping into a role she had earned rather than inherited, of a system slowly learning to treat ordinary people as though their dignity mattered. Reese Calder had never needed a raised voice, a polished badge, or a line of officers trailing behind him to prove that his authority was real. What he needed, and what he ultimately built, was a system that treated an ordinary person walking through the front doors with the same seriousness it once reserved only for those it feared. Real power, he had come to understand long before that morning, was never about commanding a room into silence through intimidation. It was about forcing an entire institution to finally treat the people who had no power at all with the basic decency they had always deserved.